to the meaty part, the fabulous, the insightful, our fearless foresight leader, Madame Jennifer O'Rourke.
So with that awkward pause as I try to unmute. So hi everyone, as Jasmine just said, my name is Jennifer O'Rourke. I'm the Senior Research Advisor and Foresight Lead at HRI. And if you hear any commotion or barking, that's my German Shepherd Link, and I'm just gonna apologize in advance for his contributions. So a little about me before I start. I previously worked at Policy Horizons Canada as a foresight analyst on the future of geopolitics, emerging global challenges, the future of the economy, and the future of work. I've also led foresight projects as part of my graduate studies on the future of banking and security and the future of crime, all prior to coming to HRI. So when I was working at Policy Horizons on the future of work, we had multiple government partners involved in the study, and one of them was HRI. When the study wrapped up, I transitioned over to HRI to build off of that work and lead a study on the future of HR. So our foresight team at HRI undertook this study and then kind of pivoted when COVID hit to examine what the next couple of years could look like, given our understanding of the future of work and the disruptions that are resulting from a global pandemic. So the work I'm going to present to you today is the result of all of this research. I will first discuss what foresight is and why we do it, challenges and factors needed for success working in foresight, and then I'll get into the process that our team used and the findings of our work. Next slide, please, Deanna. Okay, so let's get into it. One thing we can say with certainty about the future is it's not really optional. We can't remain frozen in time even if we want to. So knowing this, how can we best prepare for it? This is where strategic foresight comes in. And to be clear, foresight is not about predicting the future. I would be probably quite rich right now if that was true. So it's also not the same as forecasting. Rather, they complement one another. Foresight is a systematic and rigorous process that we use to explore a range of plausible alternative futures. When we do strategic foresight, we're often examining and trying to understand how a particular issue or system could evolve into the future and what challenges and opportunities could arise. By doing this, we can better prepare ourselves for uncertainty and surprise, which helps us to build more robust policies and programs. So kind of trying to future-proof. I won't get into too much detail on this, but I just wanted to note that there are different tools and methods you can use in strategic foresight. There's not really one method that rules them all. Most foresight practitioners will design a process or a toolkit, that works best based on the need or the work that they're trying to fulfill. So for our study, we used the method that's most used by Policy Horizons, and it was designed specifically for foresight work within the government. If you want to see more about that, you can Google Horizons and they have their manuals and everything online. Next slide, please, Deanna. Perfect. So I mentioned alternative futures a moment ago. Now I want to explain what I mean about this. So this is the cone of plausibility. It's a great visual aid in understanding that there are a range of plausible futures that might occur. If you look at the center of the cone, that's where we are today, the present. To the left is the past, things that have already happened and that we have data on. And to the right, we have the future. The line going straight through the center of that cone is the expected future. A simple way to think of the expected future is the idea that tomorrow is going to be just like today and so on and so forth into infinity. So you take any given data point from the past and you just project it on as if it's going to continue. What we do know, however, is that change happens over time, and eventually we'll be in a state that does not look at all like our current reality today. This is where that right-hand side of this cone comes in. So you'll notice the further you go to the right, the wider this cone gets. And that's because the further we think about and look into the future, the wider the range of alternative futures that could occur. Also, there are limits to what can happen. So if you see on the edges of that right cone, it says limits to plausibility. So generally anything outside of here are things that are really not likely to happen, we don't have evidence for. So for example, alien invasions, even though I'm sure there's somebody that will argue with me, there's some evidence about that. For now, it's outside the cone. So the last thing I want to say about this cone is that there's no data on the right-hand side because the future hasn't happened yet, so it's impossible for us to have data on it. This doesn't mean though that foresight is not based in evidence. There's plenty of evidence and research and indicators of change that are occurring today and even in the past that really help us gain an understanding of the different ways the future could unfold. Next slide, please. All right. So working in strategic foresight is not without challenges. At the base of some of these challenges is the simple fact that Most humans are comfortable with what's familiar, predictable, and known. We're not as comfortable with the opposite. So what is unfamiliar, unpredictable, and unknown, really things that we feel like we can't control. In a work context, we also face a lot of constraints working in government. We have a significant amount of today matters that take up most of our time and effort, as well as just our mental space. Futures work and foresight are also not always widely understood and can be looked at often as nice to haves instead of crucial business lines in strategic planning. On top of this, resources and expertise in the field are generally scarce. So what ends up happening is that foresight is undertaken as a side of the desk kind of task, if it's undertaken at all, which isn't ideal for getting robust results. So knowing all this, it's still vital that we do this work. Can you go to the next slide, please? All right, so I love this quote here from Michael Wernick that says, "It's not good enough, as the cliche goes, to be preparing for the last war." That means on so many fronts that we need to try to think ahead. So if we want to think of this quite literally, it could look like showing up to a war where your enemies have drones, autonomous weapons, robo-dogs, yes, that's a thing, and augmented humans, and you show up with foot soldiers and traditional weaponry. This likely isn't going to go well for you, and the excuse that you didn't have time to understand how the rest of the world is evolving wouldn't really fly. So I recognize that's a bit of an intense example, but it's also really true in how we work. So when we put all of our energy on today tasks and we don't adequately plan for the future, we end up working in a very outdated and inefficient manner, which makes it even harder to not only modernize, but to be well positioned in a rapidly evolving world. And the knock-on effects from that can be staggering. So everything from not being an attractive place to work, having a frustrated citizenry over cumbersome processes, and losing a lot of money over inefficiency. That's just to name a few. So knowing these challenges, how can we overcome them? Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, Deanna, can you go back one? My bad. So the first step is knowing how to bring people along into the future in a safe and comfortable way. So most foresight practitioners recognize that dealing with the future can be scary and uncomfortable for people, which is totally okay. It's absolutely okay to be worried about the future. But the cool thing is the more we begin to understand what changes are coming, the less scary they become and the more empowered we are to have some control over how they'll play out and even make them work to our advantage. So going back into the practicalities of what it means to undertake foresight work, I'm going to highlight a few keys to success in running a successful foresight project. Next slide, please. All right, so number one, you need commitment across all levels. So from the bottom up, top down. And like I mentioned before, foresight's not always well understood. So having an executive champion is often quite vital. A lot of people are looking for, they have expectations of concrete and quick results in work. And with foresight, it is a longer process usually. So you really need someone that understands that and can stand by it as it takes time. The other thing is that often foresight is mistaken for a change management initiative, when really it's setting the groundwork for a really great change management or transformation initiative. Co-creation. So you want as much collaboration as possible. The more voices around the table, the greater diversity in viewpoints, which is critical. It's also important because you want to include experts in the system you're looking at. So you might have an expert in strategic foresight, but they're not going to be an expert in every subject and system they look in. So you really want to combine the two. And the last thing was co-creation. The more you involve other people, the more ownership they feel over that future, which is really important because it kind of takes it from people thinking that it's this thing out there to this thing that it's in their face and in their jobs and something they need to consider and plan for. And the last one's obviously you need the resources, expertise in the area, and clear project management. So trust and open-mindedness. This is important because you're asking people to really open their minds and think about things they might not have ever considered. So you need to be patient and realize that it's challenging to think about the future and what might occur. So next slide, please. All right, the process. So now we're getting into our work, which is kind of the juicy stuff. This is the process we use for our future of HR work. The framing we base off previous future work as well as mapping out the HR system. For the scanning and literature review, we examined existing literature on the future of work in HR. So this includes things like forecast major trends, expected futures, other foresight work. So there are other foresight institutions in many governments and also private corporations, not-for-profits. And we also looked at historical analysis of the system. And then we scan for weak signals of change. So these are often things we're looking for that nobody else is really talking about. And you can often add value in foresight when you find these things, because you really want to find like what are other people, like what aren't we expecting? What do we need to be thinking about? And from there, we looked at all this and we identified the change drivers that could disrupt the future. And then we developed our scenarios on plausible futures for HR. Also, don't worry, I'm going to go into the drivers and the scenarios in a second. So that's why I'm just kind of skipping over them quickly right now. And from the scenarios, we constructed a preferred future state for HR, as well as things that we want to avoid. And from there, you kind of have a choice. Like your foresight study can kind of wrap up here. But then from there, if you want to build a long-term vision, apply the foresight and actually build some change management transformation process, you can do that from here. So next slide, please. And then the next one. Thank you. All right, so getting into the change drivers, here are some of the key change drivers that we identified. So digital labor platforms and automation drive job unbundling and temporary task-based work. So the idea here is that automation doesn't need to completely replace a job in its entirety. Rather, parts of specific jobs can be automated, thus augmenting what that job looks like and breaking work down into tasks. We couple this with the fact that digital labor platforms are already well established, and we could really see a rise in temporary and task-based work. So what this could look like in somewhere like the public service is that, you come in, you log in, and you're actually assigned tasks. And these can even be from other units or departments. And it's a lot more about using your expertise and your skill sets. So I don't know about everyone else, but my job involves a lot of tasks and things that I have to do that really don't have anything to do with my particular expertise. So this is about that efficiency and kind of putting your resources where best possible. And hopefully the AI can do a lot of that other work. AI and robotics. So a lot of people, when they talk about AI, they think like of job displacement from automation. But what we're thinking about here is how can it actually enhance our ability to do certain jobs? So for example, in knowledge work, AI can be used to examine multiple resources in minutes as opposed to a human that takes, say, like 500 hours total estimate. We see this with AI in health. So if you're a doctor examining a medical image, you have your experience of, say, looking at 600 scans so far in your career to base a diagnosis off of. You get an AI that can look at scans, and suddenly you have an AI combing through millions of scans, even just like if they're domestic, say Canadian scans from doctors, and providing the doctor with some diagnosis recommendations in seconds. So you then now have a doctor with the expertise and an AI. So that doctor's ability to accurately diagnose goes up significantly. With physical work and robotics and AI, you can think there are things right now. So where people can wear a haptic suit. So there's actual feedback with a remote robot. So say there's a remote robot in like a disaster zone looking for people. The person can actually feel and sense what the robot's doing, and it can be more careful in uncovering and looking for humans, but also not putting that human being at risk. So they're not going into that disaster zone themselves. Combined digital tech, so augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality. Also, I'll say there are definitions for all of these at the end of the presentation, which is on our GC Collab, I believe. If I'm wrong about that, somebody from my team, please clarify in the chat. These combine with relocation incentives to facilitate a rise in remote work. So with this tech, if you want to think of it, you can have a meeting. My whole team could actually be in my office with me. I have some smart glasses on and they're here kind of as holograms, but it's the same thing for them. So to them, I appear in their rooms. Relocation incentives. So there are some jurisdictions that are actually offering financial incentives to come and work and spend there because local spending is important. So you could work for, the United Arab Emirates and you could live in Tofino, BC and take the $1,000 they'll offer you to live and spend in their jurisdiction for their local economy. So yeah, you could see a big increase in borderless remote work and advancements in digital technology. So more and more devices are capable of gathering data and communicating with each other. So this allows for things like smart homes and smart workplaces. You could think of this like there's AI right now that can kind of read your mood and how you're feeling. So say I had an AI that flagged to my boss, like Jen was smiling 40% less today and she seemed 35% more agitated. You might want to check on her, check out her workload, that kind of thing. And not all these drivers, of course, are going to be about tech. So these last two are not. We have declining trust in governments. So it looks at decreased trust in government and institutions and how that's driving demand for increased transparency and lending itself to other entities taking on services usually provided by government. So, for example, mega corporations offering to provide internet infrastructure for entire nations. There are also drug cartels that are offering like health services, dental, and that kind of thing. Not condoning that, it's just a thing that's happening. And then changing societal expectations of employers. So we've seen with kind of the rise of infinite access to information and people's ability to reach the world and communicate with one another that societal issues are coming more and more to light, and people are more and more expecting employers to actually take a stand on social issues, and they'll, even so far as going like leaving a company if they don't take a stand or they take one that they don't agree with. So people looking for aligning their own values with who they work for. So next slide, please. All right, so what does this mean for HR? So just quickly, like if you think of predictive analytics, data centricity, biometrics, we could see a world where you log onto your workspace with biometrics. So it just looks at your eyeball. Shouldn't be too surprising. A lot of us already have facial recognition, thumbprints on our phones. And then you can have data collected about you and your devices and have a hyper personalized learning plan. So, an analysis of like, these are the areas you need to grow in. Here's what we think you should do. And this can change in real time. You could also have that for your mental health, reskilling, all sorts of things. Reputation systems. So these exist today already, and they can play a significant role in the future of work, especially if you think, we could be moving to a global kind of platform-based work. So in China, they have a Sesame credit system. They also have private corporations that have some reputation systems. And these things have, they gather data from your banking, your social media, so who you hang out with, how you spend your money, do you have outstanding fines, do you pay your taxes? And then you get a public score. And this can actually limit like how you travel, where you can travel. They even have things like public shaming. So say you go to a train station that's flagged like there's a warrant out for you, you can appear on a billboard. So it's a pretty serious thing to consider if we think of that coming into the world of work. It could be what access you have to jobs and where you can work. And job unbundling and borderless work, I already kind of went over that, so I will go to the next slide. All right, so building scenarios and a preferred future. Next slide, please. All right, so for our scenarios, we use this 4-archetype approach. This approach is one that is used at Policy Horizons quite often. It just helps you frame like the different ways the future could play out based on what you know of the change drivers. So muddling through, this scenario is really about reacting all the time. So I think of it kind of as putting out fires as they come up. So, something bad happens, you've got to react. And so maybe you try to put in a policy or something. So you're always just kind of working to fix things. Incremental progress. In this scenario, things are generally getting better, but in an incremental way. But I always caution with this scenario, there's also the chance of an over-embracing of change. So things can go wrong there as well. You can have consequences. An example of that would be not regulating AI use in corporations, and somebody went and used an algorithm to hire, and it turns out it was super biased and there was a lot of discrimination. And we don't find out until way later when a lot of people have already kind of been victimized by it. Incremental decline is kind of the opposite of the previous one. So things are kind of steadily getting worse. Now, this can be from just trying to kind of have a head in the sand approach and hope that change isn't happening and holding out as long as you can, or it can also be active resistance. So really putting in policies to try to like stop change from happening. And this gets to the point where a system can break because it can't keep up with it. And lastly, we have transformation. So in this scenario, it's often a response to an opportunity or a crisis. and it's significant departure from the current state. So if you think of the last two scenarios I mentioned, one of those could have been something that flipped into transformation. So we've usually learned, and it's a more positive scenario. So we've kind of worked out the kinks of the future and we're doing better. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide is obviously not meant to be read. I just wanted to highlight what this process kind of looks like in reality. So this is a snapshot of our scenario matrix, just like a little chunk of it. So what you do is you have your four scenarios at the top and your change drivers on the left, and then you work through each scenario and what each driver, so the green was all our change drivers, we had more, what they could unfold like in the scenarios. And then in the red, you can apply specific lenses. So for us, they were HR lenses. For example, we had like wellness and safety, and we had workforce management, among a whole bunch of other ones. So given what we've seen in this scenario, how could that impact HR is where the lenses come in. Next one, please. All right, so this led us to building a preferred future. And something I really want to emphasize here is when you're building the preferred future, you're not just sitting around saying like, this is what I desire as a human. It's not like an opinion-based thing. It's taking all this stuff we saw. So we have a fairly good idea all this change is coming. Okay, so how could it evolve in the best way given that it's already coming? So from that preferred future, from our scenario work, our team went through and we analyzed, we took out pieces that were like, these could be positives for HR. We did this with other people as well. So we had some HR experts involved in this process. And then we also saw things where like, oh, we really don't want that to happen. And from there, we had two lists, like a preferred future and a future to avoid. And from that list, we obviously focused on the preferred future. We started looking at, okay, are there some themes going on here? And so we ended up coming up with these four themes for a preferred future. So the first one we have here is human experience and lifestyle. The core idea behind this is that everything can be really hyper-personalized. So work could evolve in a way to place, oh, sorry, I skipped ahead of my notes here. So this is like hyper-personalized everything. So I already kind of mentioned this earlier, but if you have great data about your employees, about yourself as a human, and you have automation, you can have like customize everything. So customize learning plans, career planning, mental health, even the hours you work. And it's a blurring of that. It's employees being able to kind of, match their lifestyle and their work in a much more efficient and better manner for them. Trust and transparency. In this one, we have increased transparency and trust. So this is between employee and employer, as well as the government and citizenry overall. This results in much more open and accessible work environment, and it fosters a reduction in inefficiencies and increased collaboration efforts among departments. So can you just imagine if there was a way that all of our work was just open for us to see and we could just reach out and like be working with each other on different documents? That's kind of the picture we painted there. And then service delivery. So we did look at this for, service delivery as a government, but specifically for HR, it's about offering customized, efficient, and timely service. So HR processes becoming streamlined. So as an employee or job candidate, you submit information like one time and it goes to all the appropriate places. So you're not filling in your address and date of birth like 30 times every time you want to do a certain thing. And it's really based on the user. So it's user-centric design and very efficient. And diversity and inclusion. So with this one, it's about being able to harness tech to help us improve in diversity and inclusion. For example, using like real-time translation earbuds that allow us to communicate in multiple languages. So maybe with this, you could see, the inclusion of all Indigenous languages into official languages. And just any other language, you're just able to communicate. So you can consult experts, you can consult other academic resources that are not in English or French. There's also a shift maybe to global accreditation that allows much more diversity in the workforce and an increase in fairness and unbiased hiring processes, promotions, and opportunities. So obviously that's me trying to just give you the highlights of these things. We will be publishing more about it with more information. And that is all I have on our foresight. Jasmine, that's with you.
Sorry, glitching away, just like you. Thank you, Madame O'Rourke. Super insightful, very exciting. You're already stimulating a lot of chat. So if you wouldn't mind jumping on and addressing some of the participants' questions and comments, that would be super. Thank you. And now for the second half of our session today. He has become a household name when it comes to HR innovation. He's been keeping an eye out on everything that's been happening in that domain, so we wouldn't have to. And today we are privileged to have him with us today so that he can share his findings with us. So please welcome the one and only Mr. Etienne Laliberté.
Bonjour, hi everyone. So today I will present you some of the key takeaways from a research project that I did last fall entitled Interviews on the Future of Public Service HR. Basically, our ADM of HR in the department asked our HR innovation unit to come up with a long-term vision for HR in the department. And I proposed to survey a wide array of people across the public service, HR leaders, both executives, HR innovators, HR specialists, and even people outside the HR function, and just solicit their thoughts on what that future of HR may look like in the public service of Canada. Deanna, if you can move to the next slide. So basically, we use unstructured interviews and a small set of questions to get the conversation going, but I really left the interviewees take the conversation wherever they wanted. And at the end of this, we did the analysis and we merged that, or actually brought that in parallel with the finding of the foresight to feed into the development of a long-term vision for HR. Next slide. So I approached 550 people for the interviews. About over a third accepted and scheduled interviews with me. The interviews took place over an 8-week period, and out of this exercise, I collected over 100 hours of recorded content, or if you prefer, 700 pages of transcript. About 2/3 of the interviews were conducted in English, 1/3 in French or bilingual, which is very much representative of the two official languages in the public service. And half of all the respondents were executives. You have a breakdown in the pie chart on the right of your screen. The other half were non-executives, and I would say about 70 to 75% of the people approximately were from the HR function. The others were on the periphery. Next slide. In total, 42 organizations were consulted. You see a very high representation of people from ESDC and Service Canada, which is quite understandable given that it was an HR vision for our own department, but I also got really high response rate from OCRO, the Canada School of Public Service, the Canada Revenue Agency, other places, the Treasury Board, Public Service Commission, and then line department. So you got a breakdown of all 42 organizations there. So I like to think that what I heard was representative of a pretty wide range of views across the federal government. Next slide. So what we asked the interviewees was basically imagine the HR function of the future in light of the past year and the reset forced by the pandemic in terms of problems, gaps, limitations we need to address, as well as opportunities that HR must seize. Also, I was very interested in looking into the mindsets and the behaviors that are holding HR back and those that we must develop in HR. And I asked both about the big fundamental changes that we must make in the next decade, but also what might be some of the next concrete steps we might take, and any other questions that the interviewees would like to get answers to. Next slide. And by the way, this deck is made available on my GC Collab group and will also be available on the GC Collab group of the HR innovation team. And you will find in annex all the interview questions that were asked. What you got in front of you here on this screen is an extract from the English interviews only, so about 2/3 of all the interviews. And these are the most frequently mentioned words that I heard in the interviews. It's a good indicator of what topics have surfaced. However, the challenge of doing the qualitative analysis of such a big scale of interviews is not finding the most frequently mentioned words. It's more about making sense of that content and organizing it in a way that propels us towards action. Next slide. So to this end, what I would like to propose is this little diagram that I will use to present the information that will follow, the takeaways. So imagine two axes. The vertical axis represents the level of autonomy or control that a department may have over issues, being a high level of autonomy and control at the top, a low level of autonomy and control at the bottom. And the horizontal axis puts on the left the smaller, more immediate challenges and opportunities that a department may seize or address, and on the right, the bigger, more ambitious challenges and opportunities that might want to tackle. So using this very simple diagram as a basis for organizing some of the key takeaways, let's see what we uncovered during interviews. Next slide. So first, in the top left quadrant, we find the smaller, more immediate challenges and opportunities for which departments have a high level of autonomy and control. And here, no surprise, but top of the list, what we heard is that work from home, telework, remote work, virtual work are all probably or hopefully here to stay. That has been mentioned by absolutely everyone in the interviews. Secondly, technology and the equipment necessary to fully enable and support that work from home, telework, remote work, and virtual work still requires improvement and investment, and that's going to keep being the case for the next few years, probably. And the last big findings in this category is that, that was mentioned by most people, is that we have a unique opportunity to grow the talent pool in the, across the country, access talent anywhere, whether we're talking about talent outside the public service that we want to bring inside that now can apply on job almost anywhere because physical location is not as great of an issue or a limitation as it used to be. But also we have an opportunity to mobilize our internal workforce on any project, on any need across the public service. Next slide. In the bottom right corner, we find the big ambitious challenges and opportunities for which departments only have a low level of autonomy and control. Here, what we find are probably the most often mentioned topic was the archaic classification system, and these are not my words, it was used by the interviewees. Whenever I asked what are some of the fundamental changes we must make to HR to remain relevant in the future, that was by far the most frequently mentioned answers. Also, a lot of people have stressed the importance of taking an enterprise approach to address some of the challenges, and that takes many shapes. A lot of people have given as example the need to develop a data analytics capabilities that cuts across all departments, that is enterprise-wide. Others have suggested perhaps to consider shared HR services for the types of jobs for which every department and agency is hiring. Another topic that was also mentioned was that the fact that HR community must take ownership of its destiny. And that requires a couple of things. It will require central agency leadership, for sure, but also a strong horizontal leadership in the HR function across all departments and agencies. And a lot of people have stressed the necessity to professionalize HR, to basically up our standards and expectations as to what HR specialists must be capable of doing. And lastly, big topic, but Government of Canada may want to rethink the employment contract to meet the new reality, whether it's looking at the terms and conditions, collective agreements. The conditions of work have changed. We are not working, or a lot of employees are no longer working in a government work site. The hours are much more flexible than they used to be, so we need to make a lot of adjustment. These changes are almost too big for any department to challenge or to take over, and this will require the leadership of the central agencies and the cooperation of all departments and agencies. So these are important, but they're not the findings to which I want to bring your attention to. Next slide, please. What I really hope that you will take away from today's presentation is this box, the top right quadrant, the big ambitious challenges and opportunities for which departments have a high level of autonomy and control. 3 key takeaways here. Number 1, data analytics and evidence-based decision making. We must leverage HR data for the strategic interventions and put the evidence at the center of the decision-making processes. Gut feelings, guesswork, and opinions are no longer enough to move HR forward. We need to look into data analytics and hard evidence. Next, HR digitalization. By digitalization, I'm not talking about converting paper to bits and bytes. What we're talking about is making our HR products and services simple, modern, digitally enabled, available anytime, anywhere, from any device. And lastly, user centricity. With user centricity, I encompass a very wide range of topics, but essentially the key here is to shift the focus of HR away from compliance with policies and processes to focus on meeting the needs of the users, whether they are managers, employees, and candidates. Next slide. So out of these key takeaways, what you should remember is that departments and agencies are already working on the most immediate challenges and opportunities we face, whether it's enabling work from home, telework, remote work, and we should sustain the momentum. So that's a big takeaway. I'm not going to talk about this anymore because all departments and agencies are already looking into it. Second, departments and agencies can influence the bigger challenges and opportunities for which strong horizontal collaboration with other organizations, the leadership of central agencies will be required. I'm not going to talk more about this because it's beyond most of our control, unless you're working at Treasury Board Secretariat, OCRO, Public Service Commission. These issues are probably too big for you. So I trust that these central agencies are working with the heads of HR across government to solve these issues. The big takeaway, once again, is the last one, that departments and agencies are still in many regards catching up with the evolution of the HR industry outside the public service. And we need to shift several of our mindsets and behaviors and tools and practices to make place for radically different ways of doing HR. And this is where departments and agencies have a lot of autonomy, a lot of control, and it's entirely up to them to make some of these strategic choices. So I will not go into the appendix, but if you are curious, I detail, paint a picture of the population that took part in the interviews. And also you'll find in Appendix 3 a small sample of quotes to illustrate the key takeaways that I've described today. So that wraps up the first half of my presentation today. Diana, you can close the PowerPoint, and maybe you can bring on the screen in the meantime the full visual that we've used to promote the event, HR 2030. I didn't include it in my PowerPoint, but this can make a nice backdrop for what follows. What I would like to talk about in the next few minutes are more of a personal perspective on the takeaways. So I'm going to take off my researcher hat, and I'm going to put on my Etienne Laliberté's hat. And I've done this presentation already maybe 3-4 times, and every time I get the same types of reaction. And here's a reaction that I typically get. It's one of 3 things. Very often, people will quickly dismiss most of what I've just presented about HR digitalization, user centricity, data and evidence-based management, or decision-making, and instead they will ask me about their area of work, their HR discipline, where it be classifications, staffing, mental health and well-being, diversity and inclusion, etc. Very often, other people will tell me that, yeah, it's nice what you presented, but it's too abstract. Can you give me something more tangible? Like, what can I do next? And the third type of reaction that I'm used to get by now is people who are saying, oh, that's very nice, but you're all talking about big system change, complex change that's way above my pay grade. I'm working in the trenches. I'm on the front line. I'm doing HR. I'm in the operations. How am I going to be able to change any of that? So let me get into some of the answers to these concerns. To the first concern, I would say this. Jennifer and I, we were asked to look at the distant future. I understand that most of us are preoccupied with the present and the near future, like what's going to happen next month, next year, perhaps. But very few of us take the time to look at the distant future. But Jennifer and I were asked to look at 10 years down the road. And there's some good news. Taking into consideration the distant future actually changes how you approach the short-term future, the near future. So if you remember from the presentation that I gave you, the key takeaways for which departments have a high level of autonomy and control you find on this visual that you have right now on your screen in the bottom left corner. We've called them the pathways. We could also look at these as strategies that we could pursue, long-term strategies, like a decade-long strategies to pursue. But if you keep an eye on these three things: HR digitalizations, data and evidence-based decision-making, and user centricity, it's bound to shape how you approach your current challenges. And this is a question that I hope many of you will start developing, a reflex that you'll start developing, is if you take these three lenses to look at your current challenges, the current problems you're trying to solve in your discipline, in your area of work, what might you be able to do differently if you look at your problem from these three lenses? I'm going to open a small parenthesis here because I know that a lot of you wonder, in particular, why we didn't put diversity and inclusion in some of these pathways or strategies. From the interviews on the future of public service HR, diversity, equity, and inclusion was probably the most frequently mentioned topic next to telework, working from home, virtual work. But it was always presented in the same way. It was a desired state. We want to achieve diversity and inclusion. We want to achieve representativity of employment equity groups. It was never framed as or rarely framed as a strategy to pursue that would allow the public service to provide better service to Canadians. Now, in the next month, I will listen again to these interviews, and I will be paying more attention to any clue that might point to diversity and inclusion as a strategy to pursue that will get us where we want. But for the moment, what I've heard from diversity and inclusion is that we are really framing it as a desired state we want to achieve. And for that reason, we have kept it in the upper part of the visual you have on your screen as a preferred future. I'm going to close the parenthesis on diversity and inclusion because I'm not going to talk specifically about it. But diversity and inclusion is one of those hot topic or discipline that you can look at using the three lenses that I've described: HR digitalization, user centricity, data, and evidence-based decision-making. Now on to the second concern that I briefly mentioned, which is that some of these concepts, these three pathways are perhaps a little too abstract, not tangible enough. What should we do next? I'm going to take a few minutes to give you some specific examples, concrete examples of where these pathways have been applied. And I'm going to try, when possible, to draw contrast between what are good examples and what are poor examples. So let's start with HR digitalization. I know the concept of HR digitalization or even digital government is a little too abstract to many of us. We often equate digital with technology. However, that is a mistake. Digital is actually much more than technology. Technology is only a tiny fraction of what it means to be digital in government. So here's an example to give you some insight into what is not digital versus what is digital. Think about the public service performance management application. You know, the application that you use annually when you have to complete your annual performance appraisal, that application. If you've ever gone through the process of doing your annual performance evaluation, you know what I'm talking about, and you know that it's not user-friendly. It's clunky. The process is fragmented. There's a lot of back and forth between you, the employee, inputting in content, then waiting for an approval from the manager, then the manager adding content. It's not a pleasant experience, not to mention that there's limited space to define work objective and provide feedback. I even know people who have received glowing evaluations, surpassed their work objective, and by the time they were done with filling their annual performance appraisal in that system, they were really frustrated because it's so unpleasant to use as a system. So this is an example where, although we're talking about a technology, although the solution is online, there's actually almost nothing digital about it. Contrast this with a different application. By now, I assume that most of you are familiar with the MyGCPay application, where you can see your pay and so it's in the pay and compensation system. But I don't know about you, but I do remember the first time I looked at that application and I fell in love with it instantly. It was clean, it was simple, intuitive to navigate. It showed graphs and data. In 20 seconds of looking at that application, I knew exactly how to navigate it. I knew exactly where to find the information that I was looking for, and it did exactly the that I needed to do. I even remember the week that it came out, I was reading on Twitter comments about public servants who were in awe or disbelief that such a neat application had been developed by the Public Service of Canada. They couldn't believe it because it was so incredibly well designed around the user needs. So this is a great example of what it means to be digital. So what else can we develop like that? Well, I would say that many, if not most, of HR products and services should take that route. We should aim for that level of digital service in HR. And the good news is that we have a precedent that exists, that MyGCPay app, which is great. But the better news is that by now most departments have the skill set and the expertise to develop such applications. And when we look at some of the products and services that the government designs for Canadians, so applications that are designed with the digital principles in mind, we should have the confidence that, we are capable of doing the same within HR. It's just about holding the same expectations for our internal services, like HR, as the services we provide to Canadians. So since I just spoke about meeting user needs, let me discuss the second pathway, user centricity. Now, I'm about to say a few things that I know will tick off a few people, may shock or even perhaps offend some HR sensibilities, but if you don't think you can hear it, now is probably a good time to disconnect from this presentation. But here it is. And the first thing I'm going to say does not even come from me. It's actually a quote from the director of HR of the BBC, or she former director of HR of the BBC, Lucy Adams, who wrote, HR typically designs solutions around two things, compliance and their own convenience. We don't design HR products and services around the user's needs. And when I think of the users in HR, I think of managers, employees, and even candidates in recruitment and staffing processes. So let's take an example, onboarding. Onboarding is a place where that's getting a lot of attention from HR right now because we have to all of a sudden onboard people virtually, and that proves to be a challenge. And whenever I hear people talk about how to improve onboarding, the typical solutions that I hear about come in the form of checklist, onboarding guides, or orientation training. None of these strike me as solutions that actually make a difference on my experience as a newly onboarded employee. I've been onboarded 11 times since I've joined governments in 11 different departments. And I can tell you that the challenges that I have faced with onboarding have nothing to do with the novelty of the pandemic. And it seemed nowhere were the process designed around me or my managers as users. For example, in the 11 onboarding experience that I've had, twice my managers didn't even know that I was starting that day. Once it took me 2 weeks to get a security card to walk around the building, and I could not even go to the bathroom without asking one of my colleagues for their card which would happen, 3-4 times a day for 2 weeks straight. Imagine how it made me feel as a new employee, having to ask your colleague every time you need to go to the bathroom for their card. Once it took me a whole month before when every morning I had to call my manager to come pick me up at the security desk because I didn't have a security card. Once it took me 5 weeks to be equipped to do my job because I had to submit myself 9 separate tickets to the IT help desk to get my computer, get my VPN activated, get my access to my email address, get a phone, get a password. It was all up to me to do that work. 5 weeks straight, I was not equipped to do my job. And then the more absurd, but I've had a job where it took me 49 days to get a computer and being equipped to do my job, and another pre-pandemic where it took me 88 days, where I was not equipped to do my job. So when we talk about user centricity, there are opportunities that to make a difference in the experience of the employees that go way, way beyond those checklists, those onboarding guides, or those orientation training. I'm going to give you an example of how to make it happen, because what I've experienced was miserable as an employee, but it was just as miserable for my managers, because my managers, while I didn't have a computer to work on, my managers were writing back and forth with 5-6 different people to try to get me a computer, and it was never clear who had the answer, who was activating the process, where was the follow-up, who was responsible for the process. It was complete chaos. But there's a better approach to do it. And I'm going to give you one example of a department that took a user-centric approach to redesign the process of pre-onboarding around its users. One federal organization created an online form that newly hired employees had to fill and submit, along with their digitally signed letter of offer. The two had to be submitted for the hiring decision to be made official. Now, once the employee clicked the submit button with the form that captured all the information captured in that form fed into 9 different processes internally: security, pay and compensation, technology, workplace facilities, etc. The email would dispatch only the data fields relevant to each process to the process owners, without going through HR, without going through the hiring managers, directly from the newly hired employee to the process owners. By doing so, that organization achieved 4 things. 1, they made the process very simple for the employee, because now the employee don't have to fill 9 separate forms. They only have to fill a single form that they submit once, and the work is done. There's no more hassle on their part. 2, the form bypassed HR completely. It went directly to the process owners, and it did not go to the hiring managers either. So these people did not encounter any friction. It was not up to them to forward emails back and forth to each of these 9 process owners. And lastly, just by automating that one form, that organization was able to reduce the work involved in the pre-onboarding process by 75%. There used to be a team of 12 people that were doing all this back and forth of email, and now they were down to 3 to just make sure that everything was going smoothly. So it was a grand slam, if you want. They hit all the boxes just by designing a process around the users. So this is what we should do with most of our HR processes. Really design them for the convenience of the users, not necessarily for the convenience of HR. Lastly, the third pathway, data and evidence-based decision-making. 2 elements here that I want to talk about. On one hand, evidence-based decision-making. On the other hand, data. Let's start with evidence-based decision-making. You might have heard of the recent audit of the Staffing Public Service Commission on staffing. And if you have, you know that they've recommended to make unconscious bias training mandatory for all hiring managers. Now, this came to me as a bit of a surprise because it was announced just like a month or 2 after the UK Civil Service decided to cancel unconscious bias training on the grounds that it did not move the needle. It did not really improve bias in staffing. And if you take an evidence-based approach to inform your course of decision, well, you will realize that actually there's quite a lot of evidence supporting the fact that the effectiveness of unconscious bias training is mixed at best and sometimes even backfires. What actually helps move the needle when it comes to curbing biases in staffing is interventions on the processes themselves. Things like opting for structured interviews, using rubrics, resorting to diverse interview panels, things like blindfold assessment. All of these things are examples of things that actually help improve or help reduce bias in staffing. So if I was asked to take a evidence-based approach to improving reducing bias in staffing, my recommendation would be, if I was asked to, can you come up with some training that will help the situation? I would probably advise, yeah, let's train managers and HR on developing assessment tools and coming up with hiring processes that curb these bias, and give them a list of maybe 30 different options that can be considered that will make staffing decisions more objective. That would be an evidence-based way to go about it. When it comes to data and evidence-based, the other part of the equation is looking at our data to see is what we're doing getting us the result that we want? Is it helping us move the needle, or should we modify what we're doing? What I'm going to say next, it might be a bit controversial, but the other day I was trying to estimate the cost of staffing and recruitment in the public service. And I had to work a few assumptions. So for example, I decided to only consider the core administration of the public service, not the separate employers, not the corporations. I decided to look only at the salary cost of HR people who are doing staffing and recruitment, and also all these other support offices that we sometimes call shadow shops that are doing operational staffing and recruitment work. So I decided to exclude the cost of assessment tests, the cost of online tools. I figured I could not really count the time that managers spend on the corner of the desk helping out with interview panels. So if I just look at the salary cost in HR and shadow shops going into staffing and recruitment, my best guess was that it probably cost the core administration of the public service annually about $100 million to do staffing and recruitment. I said $100 million, but if someone came to me and said it's actually 150, I would believe them definitely. But let's assume that we're talking about $100 million, and it's my most conservative estimate. I look at that and I have to ask, do we know whether the qualifications that we put on the job posters and the assessment tools that we use to assess all qualification, how do we know whether it gets us the right people? How do we know whether it actually gets us higher performance in the job once the people have hired? And the troubling answer is that for the most part, we don't. I really don't know of any business lines where they look into those questions. Now, I have a colleague right now who is looking exactly into answering these questions and figuring out, well, we spend a lot of time putting a qualification on these posters. Which of these qualifications actually make a difference on the quality of hires we make? So all that to say that we need to do a better job at looking at our data. HR sits on a gigantic mountain of data, and we need to look at it. So, couple of things to wrap it up when it comes to the three pathways that I described earlier: HR digitalization, user centricity, data and evidence-based decision making. How can we set these wheels in motion? Well, here are a few ideas. Number one, keep the distant future in your line of sight. Keep an eye on those three things, and they will shape the way you approach your current area of work, your current HR disciplines, the current challenges that you face in your job right now. Second, chances are that any solution that you consider will involve a blend of those three pathways, three strategies. So you might even want to look at those three pathways as a little dial. So maybe what would happen if you put a bit more emphasis on HR digitalization and a little less on user centricity? Maybe a little more on data and evidence-based and a little less on digitalization. play around with these options to see how it might help you come up with creative solutions to your current problem. There's some good news is that when it comes to mindsets, behaviors, skills, and capabilities, there's already a lot of tools at our disposal to educate us, to give us the knowledge that we need to get going with these 3 pathways. You just have to look at the Canada School of Public Service website. They have a lot of training on digital government, a lot of training on data literacy. Definitely take the time to educate yourself, get curious about it. These are essential topics for any HR advisors in the future. So take your own professional development in hands and look into it. Perhaps a short note on agility, but we need to start thinking about making our structures a bit more flexible to adapt to changing needs. And so far, historically, we've really structured HR around the traditional disciplines. However, when I look at the future, I have to ask, is there a different way we should organize HR? Shouldn't HR perhaps in the future get organized around people analytics, around user experience? And it may sound a bit bold if I say it like that, but if you are curious, just go on the internet and do a search for VP of Digital HR, VP of Employee Experience, VP of People Analytics, and you'll be surprised by how many organizations in the private sector have changed their org structure in HR to meet this new reality. So I'm not talking about fiction, it's actually already there. Lastly, I would like to leave you on a few more optimistic note, but I know that what Jennifer and I have presented so far is hard. It's a lot to absorb. It might be intimidating. And I just want you to know that you're not alone. We're all in this together, and we're all starting from the same place. So, you don't feel isolated. It's a collective challenge we need to tackle. Second, all these findings are extremely consistent with changes we observe in the HR industry outside of government. So we're not operating in our own little bubble when we present these pathways and these enablers. It's very consistent with what's out there. So that's a good thing. If you wonder where to start, I'm going to offer you a clue. But again, HR is sitting on a gigantic mountain of data. And we're using it suboptimally. So let's start by looking at the data we already have and see what we can learn from it, even if it's imperfect. And lastly, I will conclude where Jennifer kicked off the presentation. But the challenge that is ahead of us is not demanded of us. It's still optional at this point. But regardless of what we do, that future is coming at us. But right now, we have a choice to embrace those challenges and shape our destiny, or just be at effect, like be in response mode when it catches up to us. So that concludes my presentation. So I will leave you on a question, which was the exact same question that Jennifer asked at the beginning: is do we want to be prepared for this? Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Etienne. Thank you all for your wonderful participation. Etienne, we really appreciate you taking the time to share your findings. I think it confirms a lot of what we already knew. And unfortunately, some of us can relate all too well to some of the examples you've shared. So everyone in attendance today, thank you for your comments, your reactions. Please continue to share your questions in Slido, in the chat, however you prefer to interact with us. Our presenters are now available to address some of your comments. You can write them in, or you could raise your hand and I'll call on you. We can take turns, turn your camera on for our live interaction with our experts. But if I may, just because I can. Jen, I'm going to start with one of the easier questions because I have a really hard one. But have you seen promising shifts over the course of the past few years in your time as a foresight expert, or even in the last year in the pandemic, that would kind of inspire the way, the changes we need to adopt in the workplace, or how we can apply it within our own day-to-day work? What shifts and perspectives have you seen that are really exciting and inspiring for the rest of us?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some things. I'm naturally maybe a bit of a pessimist working in the future and working in an environment that's got a lot of red tape and bureaucracy, but I also understand we do work in a massive system, so change is hard. And it deters us a lot, but a lot of the stuff that I see that gives me hope are usually like smaller units and kind of grassroots pushes to innovate. So like, I think we have a fantastic public service, and there's just a lot of people that really want change and that want to be part of that change. And to me, it's more about like unifying that and really figuring out how we make it happen. And the other thing is, the more I tend to just like have one-on-ones or meetings or present, I'll get feedback from people that say, now I do my job differently, because when I get something, I think, is this thinking about the future? And so that might not sound like some great massive win, but the more people whose mindsets shift like that, the more ripple effects we get. So that's kind of my thoughts on that one.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so not too much action going on the Slido or the chat, so I will continue to take all of your time. Monsieur Laliberté, during the course of your interviews, what made you the most excited or what made you go, whoa, game changer?
I think it's whenever I heard original thoughts or impactful ways of saying or conveying known facts. But whenever I saw convergence in what people were saying, but for example, taking a topic like data analytics, I've heard a lot of great stuff on the topic, but what was fascinating at some point was what perspective that I was hearing was complementary to the other. And we're getting a very, very holistic view of a problem, but everyone looking at it from slightly different angles. That when we string together these clips from the video of interviews, and you listen to what people have to say about a topic like data, and they will and other topics as well, but you can't help but feel compelled to take action. It really makes a case for the change. And in fact, this is one product that I'm going to start working on next month, but I want to package some of these videos where I take excerpts from the interviews and just string together some of the best clips around the specific topics to add substance to the changes that I've described.
Super. Thank you, sir. Let's jump on the Slido. A really easy question from our audience. This is perfect. Do you expect that there will be more flow between the public service and non-government, private sector, academia, or otherwise, including within the public service leadership in the next 10 to 15 years? So more experience outside the government. Like I said, easy question. Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to answer the question without answering it, but it inspired me something else. I don't know what the answer to that question is. However, I can tell you that if HR gets serious about going down the road of HR digitalization, user centricity, and data and evidence-based decision making, it needs to hire people with a new skill set. And that skill set currently does not exist a lot in the public service. So either we need to upskill our HR people, or we need to recruit people from outside into the HR function, people who will bring not the traditional HR skill set that we're used to, not the traditional knowledge, but things like design thinking, agile project management, industrial organizational psychology, and I can name you a dozen more skills that we need to bring into HR in order to meet the challenges of the future.
Thank you. Jennifer, did you want to chime in or?
Sure. I think, obviously, I don't know where the government's going to go with this in the future, but I do know when a big part of foresight and futures work is consulting people on future stuff. So generally when we undertake foresight studies, we reach out to experts in the field. There's a lot of talk between other foresight units. So in that area, for sure, and I think it's vital that we continue to do that. Unfortunately, I don't know which way we're going to go.
Nice. Thank you. We have a hand up. So Gayla Tibbetts.
Good afternoon, everybody. Gayla Tibbetts here from CERNAC. I'm wondering, I asked a question in the chat, and maybe it was missed. This has come out of ESDC. So what is the support that you're getting from your senior leaders in terms of becoming a more flexible service line as it relates to HR and staffing and recruitment and all of the great things that you guys have talked about? Are HR advisors going to be given that flexibility to apply the Public Service Employment Act in these ways that you're describing?
That's a very good question.
Yeah, we're all
I'm
nodding.
actually inclined to pass it more to John. So I just put you on the
Yeah,
spot, but I think
100%.
I think it's above my pay grade.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'll note that we're kind of in the early days, and I would say that we do have very strong support. And in fact, this exercise was, supported at the senior management of the branch in terms of thinking about where our branch is going within ESDC over the next 5 to 10 years. So we're still, I would say we're still in early days of thinking about what does that mean for the branch? How do we make those shifts? So we're not quite there yet, but I would note, yes, there is support. It's just a matter of figuring out what does that actually look like. And again, still work to be done on that front. Does that answer your question?
Sure, it does, John. Because it begs the question for me that once you guys, well, you are obviously very much on the road to success here. And once you are achieving that and actually the work is being done within your department, how will you share that success across the government, across the federal family, so that other HR shops can jump on the boat with you guys?
Yeah, thank you. We definitely want to work out in the open. So events like this, sharing some of our findings, we will continue to do so. We have a GC Collab page. So yes, we definitely want to work in the open. So stay tuned. We'll be sharing things as they happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
I notice Etienne also has his hand up. If you want to jump in, Etienne.
The challenge of organizing HR to better meet the demands is not unique to the public service. Private sector is always struggling with the same questions. No one has found the exact service delivery model that allows them to do this without any friction. But there's one basic question that we can ask ourselves in HR, in the public service, that has to do almost with the why we do HR. And if HR wants to be seen as relevant, remain relevant in the eyes of its clients, it only has to do really one thing. It needs to take a load off the shoulders of managers without dumping that load on the employees. If it succeeds in doing only that, HR will always be welcome at the table. HR will always be seen as a partner, as a friend. But if we are there to impose constraints, impose process, impose more requirements on managers and employees without helping them, without making their life easier, we're in the wrong business. And I say that because it is problematic. It is something that surfaced in the interviews. I use it very politically correct, the word user centricity. But what I've heard from the mouth of the people I've spoken to is that we just don't have that client focus. That service orientation, we simply don't have it. And that's not me saying it. I'm echoing what I've heard from the interviews, but it was stated to me exactly the way I just said it.
Thank you. Thank you for jumping in. We're going to go back to our Slido question. One of our most popular questions is, what are some of the challenging mindsets that are preventing the average HR practitioner to embrace the future?
So in the products that I will create based on the interviews on the future of public service HR, there will certainly be a few products that will be focusing solely on mindsets and behaviors. But I can tell you right away that the mindset that I've heard being mentioned, being named the most often as when it comes to being an obstacle to the way to what we do in HR has been risk aversion. By far, like it's at the top of the list in terms of obstacles. When we think of mindsets that are enablers, then there are multiple that have surfaced. I really enjoy hearing things like curiosity, creativity, that service orientation, that service culture. They were all great. But for me, when I looked at all the interviews that I've heard, I'm almost tempted to separate the answers that I've heard in two categories. And I'm not talking about the interviewees, but really their answers. But answers tended to fall in one of two groups. There were answers that kind of normalize the problematic. And here's what I mean. There are issues, but we don't want to bring too much attention to these problems. We almost say, well, it's the way we've always done things. It's that problem has been around for a long time. It's too big for us, so we're not going to solve it. So just let's not delve too much into it. But then there were other answers that were not satisfied with the status quo and problematized the normal and said, well, for example, onboarding. No one has really not aware of any department that really has a smooth onboarding process where employees are functional on day one on the job, and that's unacceptable. There's no private sector company that would allow their employees not to be equipped to their job on day one. It just doesn't happen. Why is it so widely the norm here in the public service? So there are people that when they answer their question, they would problematize the normal. This is not acceptable. We should not put up with this kind of thing. So I think it goes back to a form of mindset, being willing and having the courage to and like reject the status quo. This is unacceptable. We can let that happen.
Madame O'Rourke, anything to say on larger mindsets and shifts, not only maybe within the HR community, but in a wider sense as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to some of the stuff I presented, and it's this idea that, one, we're kind of hardwired to not want change, even if we think you do, or we don't like the familiar, maybe I should say it's better, or the unfamiliar, sorry. So naturally, we want to be able to control things. So you get a lot of resistance with futures work and planning because, one, people don't always like what you have to say. So it's really having a shift to a more open mind and recognizing that when you're doing this kind of work, you're not trying to scare people or force them into like a drastic change into the 10 years. We're talking about 10 to 15 years plus. It's about planning. Like, you get a preferred future and you backcast and you make it work in incremental ways. So there's that openness. Also the recognition and placing importance on strategic planning and things like any futures kind of work, because we allocate a massive amount of resources to today problems and we don't always put that time into the futures thinking. So it's really stepping back and having a mindset that's more long term. Those are just the top of the line for me.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you. So lots of activity in the Slido, lots of activity in the chat. If we only have 2 minutes left, because we want to give you enough time to run to your next meeting, so if you don't mind, we're going to compile all of the questions that we haven't had an opportunity to answer, and we will post the responses on our wiki page. Of course, some of these questions are not within our area of expertise, so we'll let some of the experts chime in as well. So I've been trying to, do you believe change is only left to central agencies like the PSC or OCRO or PCO? Can departments do their own experimenting? And do we have any examples?
Yes. I mean, no. Yes to the second part. Yeah, I mean, Etienne, you can probably talk much more about the central agency piece of this, but there's lots of grassroots change. Even at ESDC, example, we have an innovation fund. So that's what our DM Flack, he put an innovation fund and panel together for grassroots innovation. So to fund people to do things like below the EX level, to have change and see what things can happen and pilot. And we have meetings all the time with units like our own that are working all around trying to do the same thing.
Thank you. Etienne?
Well, there are two big questions there. Do you believe change is only left to the central agencies like the PSC or CRO? The answer to me is clearly no. It's not just up to them. And in fact, in my interviews, I've had a number of ADMs of HR that have called on the entire HR community to take control of their destiny. They didn't point the finger at Okro. They didn't point the finger at public information. They said, this is a leadership issue, a collective leadership issue of all the heads of HR that need to come together to address this. So definitely not just up to central agencies. And can departments do their own experimenting? Absolutely. There's a tree. Actually, that's where the innovation is happening. It's in the trenches. It's really close to the front line, to the, actually, in my department right now, the best example of HR innovation that I see are happening at the front lines. People like business lines that have specific hiring needs and are deciding, I'm going to try this thing, and they go and they do something really creative with it. And as an example, but on Friday I was talking with someone with a techie who was interested in HR problems, and I was just trying to come up with a list of original HR solutions that are a good example of how to do innovation, how to be creative to solve these problems. And without any thinking, I had a list of 13 examples on my notepad that I want to share with this person. So there's a tremendous amount of experimentation and innovation happening on the front lines.
100%. That's why we'll keep having these sessions, because we want to showcase them. We want to educate other departments, other entities as to what is possible and what is doable, what is scalable, what lessons learned can be shared, et cetera, et cetera. So please stay tuned. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Like I said, we'll compile some of these questions, which are excellent, by the way, and we will try to post some answers as we develop them. So thank you all so much for attending our first ever HR Innovation HR RH à la carte session. You've been a wonderful audience. Please take a moment to let us know how we did through Slido using the code hashtag HR Innovation. And keep an eye out on our GC Collab page, our GC Wiki page for the recordings, additional resources, more information on future events. We look forward to seeing you again, and stay safe, stay healthy, everyone.